Welcome to the Well-Seasoned Librarian podcast. This is Season 3, Episode 1. Welcome to the third season, and I'm so happy to be having Nick Malgieri today on the podcast to talk to me. I had a lovely time getting to talk to Nick. It was such a pleasure. I would have liked, an entire day of talking to Nick because he's so interesting. His life story is very fascinating. I, at one point, was talking to him about a biography, and I said, God, I see like a Netflix series in this because it's really, very interesting, his background. And he, of course, is very humble and downplays it all, but he's an eminently fascinating person, and his cookbooks are magnificent. If you're not familiar with Nick's books, they're, the backbones of most baking, and How to Bake, his republishing of one of his first cookbooks by Dover in 2018, a book I have in my kitchen and refer to almost weekly, and it actually is in my kitchen rather than in my study with all my other cookbooks, because it's one I use continually. He's a very important baker, and I think he's one of the biggest names in the baking world. And, he was still very charming and very down to earth. I loved talking to him. I would love to talk to him, another time in the future, because I don't think that, we exhausted all the topics we could talk about. I think that we really had so much to talk about that, we could have talked all day. But he's the former executive pastry chef of Windows of the World and is a 1996 inductee to the Who's Who of Food and Beverage in America. His latest book, as I said, was How to Bake by Dover Books in 2018, but he's got hundreds more books. Check them out online on Amazon. There's many. You should buy them all because they're definitely worth, purchasing. His book on pastry is amazing, among others, and I really think you should definitely have at least, a few, if not all, of his books in your repertoire. His book on bread is essential, of course, and his book on chocolate is, if you're serious about baking and like to work with chocolate, you should have his book on chocolates. So, without further ado, I'm going to go right to the interview because it's wonderful. And as I said, I would talk to him again in a heartbeat. And this is just a great week to start off with him on the third season, and then later on Friday we're having the wonderful Dory Greenspan, who is also just a joy to talk to. So this is just a banner week, and I think I said in my interview with Dory that I feel like I won the lottery, and just getting to talk to Nick and Dory alone among all the other wonderful guests that I have this season, I feel truly blessed. And this podcast has been such a joy to me, and I truly have had such a good time getting to interview everybody. I just feel continually like I'm so lucky and blessed here. So I'm going to end on that and go right to the podcast. Welcome to the Well-Seasoned Librarian podcast. Today I'm honored to have pastry chef Nick Malgieri on with us. He is the author of numerous cookbooks, most recently, How to Bake, the 2018 republication of the 1995 cookbook that all of you probably have in your libraries at home. Nick, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I want to begin, as I do with many authors, to ask, where did it all begin? How did you become a pastry chef? What started it for you?
Birth. I was born right after World War II, and my father was in an apprenticeship program to become an upholsterer. I believe his salary was $6 a week. And my mother worked in a sweatshop. And fortunately, her mother, my maternal grandmother, lived with us. So she was really, my grandmother did all the housework and cooking, and she loved to bake. So for the first 5 years of my life, I was around her constantly. There was an effort to put me in a nursery school that was half a block away, but I complained so bitterly about the food, they didn't make me go anymore. So my grandmother loved to cook and bake, and she had grown up in southern Italy, but she came from a well-to-do family, And when she was young, a pastry chef from Naples retired back to his hometown, and he used to give my mother and my grandmother, sorry, and one of her cousins baking lessons. So she knew about baking a little bit more than your average Southern Italian housewife. And she also loved to do it, and I was around it constantly. The other thing that my grandmother gave me, which was one of the greatest gifts of my life, was I grew up bilingual. So
Oh,
she didn't speak Italian, she spoke Neapolitan dialect, which is what they speak in the area near where she came from. But it was a tremendous key for me, because once you have a second language growing up, you're not inhibited about speaking another language, as many American kids are. And also, once you understand the rudiments of one Romance language, you can pretty much, understand all of them. So Ripple dissolved to the point where I started college, and the only thing I ever really loved was languages. So I majored in French. I had 4 years of Latin in high school,
wow.
and I think 3 years of French. And because I went to a small college, there weren't that many classes in French. So I did a year of Italian, because that way I learned the Italian that's in books as opposed to what my grandmother spoke. And I also did a year of German, which really was something that it was a very, very lucky thing for me, because eventually, after I graduated from college, didn't really want to go to graduate school, decided to go to culinary school instead. And my pastry teacher in my second year at the Culinary Institute of America, which was their first year in their new campus in Hyde Park, New York, my pastry teacher was a Swiss. His name was Albert Kuhmann. He was very, very well known at the time, and eventually wound up becoming pastry chef at the White House during President Carter's administration. And when I had my class with him, he said, "Anybody here want to be a pastry chef?" I was the only one who raised my hand.
Wow,
So after
really?
the class, he said to me, "Yeah, because there were no specific. Nowadays, they have specific courses at the CIA, but back then it was just the course. Everybody took it, and I didn't. I did it enthusiastically, because I said to myself, I know I want to be a pastry chef, but it's also good to know all that other stuff." So what Albert said to me was, and he became a lifelong friend and mentor, considered me a member of his family.
Right.
He said, "If you're serious about being a pastry chef, you have to go to work in Switzerland."
Oh,
So I said, "Well, that's easier said than done." And then as the semester progressed, there were applications that came around if you wanted to do a 1 year apprenticeship in Switzerland. So I, of course, filled it out. I
wow.
put down that I was fluent in, I wasn't really fluent in French, but that I knew French and Italian very well. So when my contract finally came through, Zurich, I had to go look on a map to see where it even was. So, and that for me was, again, another great life-changing event, because I grew up in a 100% Southern Italian country food environment. And then to be first to go to culinary school, where, I did things like taste salmon for the first time,
Oh, yeah.
because that wasn't one of the food. We ate squid and, and everything
Yeah.
else. But so that was very an eye opener for me. But then to be transplanted from this, very much Southern Italian American home to 100% Nordic culture was so strange. And to me, it was exotic, because
Yeah.
it was like nothing I had ever experienced before. And I embraced it 110%. I loved everything about it. And I still have friends to this day. I arrived in Switzerland to do that apprenticeship August 1st, 1973. And just this past August 1st, I spoke with a friend of mine. He now lives in Lugano. We met on the first day that I arrived there because he worked in the hotel where I was going to be working. And I called him up and I said, hey, 48 years. I said, don't worry, I'll be there for the 50th.
Oh my God, that must have been amazing.
Yeah, it was a great experience. And from there, I, through social connections of friends of the people I worked with, met somebody who lived in southern France. And I got an invitation to visit with this family. And they took me the first night I was there to visit with their cousin who owned a tiny hotel pension in Monte Carlo, on the last working class street in Monte Carlo. And while we were having dinner, she said to me, would you like to come to Monte Carlo to work? And I said, would I?
That's a hell of an
And
opportunity.
you know what? She made a phone call and it happened
Oh my God.
because she had previously been a phone operator in the Hotel de Paris, which is the principal hotel of Monaco. And her accountant was a food and beverage manager in one of the hotels. The Monte Carlo is mainly it's called the Sea Bathing Society and Foreigners Circle in Monaco.
Yeah.
And the prince owns most of it, and his cousin, the Prince de Polignac, owns most of the rest. And of course, that's the Hotel de Paris, Café de Paris, the casinos, numerous beach clubs, hotels, restaurants, golf course, tennis courts, Olympic pool. I mean, everything you can possibly shake a stick at. So it was a great environment. I was, when I got there a couple months early, I found out I was going to be starting work June 1st, 1974. And it was at the new sporting club. The summer sporting club, I should say, had been an outdoors only place. So if it rained, they couldn't open. And now they had this very, very 1970s style sandstone building, which was a great cylinder. And the roof revolved off. The windows descended so
Oh
that
my
the
God.
dining room had these open archways looking out to the sea. It was a spectacular place.
Wow.
And it was mainly a nightclub and gambling. So dinner, nobody really showed up for dinner much before 9 o'clock.
Right.
And and then the floor shows were spectacular.
Oh
You
yeah.
know, Dionne Warwick, Jose Feliciano, Johnny Mathis, Josephine Baker.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I met Josephine Baker the first year that I was there. Yeah,
Oh my God, what an honor.
she was amazing. When she would come early for her show, she would always come to the chef's dining room and she would say, bonsoir, monsieur le cuisinier. Good evening, cooks.
Oh my God.
And then everybody would say in unison, bonsoir, Madame Baker. And she would say, no, 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 bonsoir, Josephine. And of course we would have to repeat it. It was an exciting time, and I learned a lot. The chef that I worked with there was very paternal toward me. I
Mhm.
went and I did 3 summer seasons. And then once I did part of a winter season at a very fancy hotel close to Nice and Cap Ferrat called the Reserve de Beaulieu. And that was at the time 2 Michelin stars. Now that they give Michelin stars to hot dog wagons, it doesn't really mean the same thing that it
Yeah.
did, the better part of 50 years ago.
Yeah. So how long were you a pastry chef before you went on to become an instructor in culinary academies?
Well, what I did was when I came back to the United States after the first season, so I had stayed away for about a year and a half, and I came back and it was the holidays. So as soon as the holidays were over, I started pounding the pavement in New York, thinking, okay, I'll get this great job. and I'll live in New York. And so I found temp work at the Waldorf.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, it was banquet temp work. I remember my first day of work, all I did was open cans. Uh,
Yeah.
it was pretty intense. And Arno Schmidt, the executive chef, when he introduced me to the always drunk banquet chef, Johnny D, he said, and Nicolas has worked in France. So, and he kind of gave me this look like, who the hell are you, And so I remember later that day, I was on my can opening binge, and he wanted me to do something else. So he yells across the kitchen, "Hey, Frenchie!" So that was it. The name stuck.
Oh no.
And it was a really rollicking time, because it was, he would he had this baseball bat that he would bang on the table with
Oh my
when the
God.
waiters were picking up. So the waiters knew that if they want, because those banquet waiters, they were very sly. If they were going to bring in one service of, prime rib, and they could sneak a second tray when he wasn't looking, then it would be in the back for them to enjoy after.
Okay.
So that's what the baseball bat was for, that if
I
they
see.
dare lifted a finger to grab the second platter, they were going to get clobbered. He got so mad at one waiter once, he cleared the table. There was this, folding banquet tables that he would use as a slide.
Uh-huh.
He picked up one of those tables and threw it at the guy.
Oh my God.
I know. It was like I used to fear for my life when I went to work there.
I saw a comment in an interview where you mentioned that one of the restaurants questioned your credentials from abroad.
Yes. Yeah. In fact, you know what? Since you had put that in the list of questions, I went to look up. It was Roger Fessaguet. He was he had the really bizarre combination of being a French chef and a United States Marine.
Oh yeah,
And
okay.
yeah, in fact, I'm happened to see, before I was reading, I Googled him and I found his obituary, and sure enough, memorial donations could be made to the United States Marine Corps.
Oh my God.
So he was, which I didn't know about him, but it's a very strict militaristic type person. The restaurant was La Caravelle. And when he had first come to the United States, he had worked at what was the greatest French restaurant in the world at the time, Le Pavillon, in the old Ritz-Carlton restaurant that was started in the French pavilion of the 1930-something World's Fair.
Oh
And
yeah.
then it was so popular, it moved into the city, and its owner and, definitely big man in the dining room, Henri Soulet, also went on to open another restaurant called La Côte Basque. And they were very, very, very important restaurants. But all of the people who became the big French chefs in the United States, like Pierre Frenet, Jacques Pepin, these people all had worked at Le Pavillon. And the food at Le Pavillon was, it was spectacular. It still existed when I was a young kid, and I was a teenager, and I started learning a little bit more about food. I had a summer job at the Prudential because I grew up in Newark, and I was in the mailroom, and periodicals would come in and through our conveyor system, and we would then route them to the different offices on the different floors. And once something flew out of one of the boxes, and it was called Gourmet Magazine.
Oh yeah.
So this would have been maybe 1966. So I looked at it and I said, ooh, this looks really good. And out falls a subscription card. So I said to myself, okay, that's not stealing. It's just a subscription card. Somebody who already has a subscription doesn't need it.
Yeah.
So I got a subscription. And I remembered back then, when it was got to be the time of the month that the issue was going to be arriving, I would pray that it would arrive on a given day. And if it didn't, I'd pray harder the next day. So, with that, a kid in Newark learned all about life in Vienna and Paris and all sorts of places. It was a tremendous education for me.
So I was going to ask you, I mentioned in the intro your cookbook, How to Bake, that was re-released in 2018. It's a magnificent cookbook that I recommend to anybody. I always say I have a lot of cookbooks. I have a big library at home, and I have cookbooks that I keep in my library, and I have cookbooks that I keep in my kitchen where I use them often.
Mm-hmm.
Your cookbooks are the kind that I keep in my kitchen because I will
Thank
use
you.
them. I don't have to go very far. I can just, reach out and get it. So, and because it's got how to bake especially has a lot of good basic stuff for cooks like me who are trying to figure stuff out, that are beginning, that want to kind of learn the ropes. And I think it's a classic that anybody should have this. If you don't have it, you should. So tell me tell me about what it went into creating this for you.
Well,
What
I first got, yeah, go ahead. Do you want to finish asking the question
yeah,
before I
no,
jump in?
no, like how did you come to create it, and then how do you feel about its republication?
Well, first of all, I was teaching I was with some friends up in Cambridge outside of Boston for New Year's one year. And on New Year's Eve, I got a call from a friend of mine who was a chef in executive dining room. And not he was the manager. The chef, who had a lot of heavy social connections, said he knew somebody who was looking for somebody to write a baking cookbook. So he phoned me because he knew that was when I was teaching at the time. And he put me in touch with this man who then told me this was the era of the great, outrageous debutante, Cornelia Guest, who was
Yeah.
like one of the big New York celebrities at the time. So he said, well, here's what you need to do. You need to get in touch with my friend Cornelia Guest. And I said, the debutante? And he said, no, her cousin.
Oh,
so
okay.
so she had so this lady was an editor at a publishing company called Bobbs Merrill, late of Indianapolis. And the big feather in the hat of Bobbs Merrill was the fact that they owned Joy of Cooking.
Oh, wow.
So, which was, probably, I don't know if it's accurate to say that, but if it isn't the best-selling cookbook of all time, might very well be close to the top of that list.
Yeah.
And so she came to a demonstration class of mine. We talked afterwards. She said, she said, oh, we're going to make an offer. So they made this like really paltry offer of $5,000. But I
Oh,
said to
wow.
myself, you know what? I said, this is going to do two things for me. It's going to have a book published under my belt, and it's also going to allow me to hire an agent.
Right, right.
So, Mr. Nobody walks into a literary agency, they show you the other door on the way out.
Yeah.
But, if you've got an offer from a publisher, they have some meat to work with.
Yeah.
But what happened was no sooner did that happen that Bobbs Merrill was swallowed by Macmillan, which was
Ah.
a much bigger publishing company.
Oh,
And
wow.
I said, well, there goes my big break. And then a friend of mine whose husband was a big stock market person called me up and she said, I just read the strangest thing on the business page of the Times. It says that Macmillan is honoring all the offers made by Bobbs Merrill. Wasn't that you?
Wow, that's rare.
So I know it was, but don't forget it was the early 80s.
Yeah. Yeah.
Things hadn't gotten quite so rough financially yet.
Yeah.
So on the strength of that, I managed to hire an agent. They gave me the most junior person in the agency. And I did this book that was called Nick Malgieri's Perfect Pastry, which was not a financial success by any means, although Macmillan did up the ante to 10,000, which is
Yeah.
laughable too.
Yeah.
And I was astounded. I was home working on something one morning and I got like 10 phone calls in a row. Julia Child just held up your book on Good Morning America.
Oh,
And I
wow.
said,
Oh my
well, that's
God.
nice. Thank you. The next time I saw her, I belonged to an association of people that write cookbooks and teach and own cooking schools. And so I walked up to Julie and I said, thanks for the bouquets. Oh, you're welcome, dearie.
Oh my God.
You know, so, but that was good. And then even before that book was published, somebody was writing an article about biscotti and interviewed me, and for some bizarre reason decided to put in the as a little biographical tag of me. And by the way, he's working on a book of Italian desserts, which I was not at all at the time. So then I got an offer for another book. They upped the ante to 20,000. So you know, I wasn't arguing because I knew it was something that I could do with my eyes closed. And it enabled me to spend 3 months in Italy, traveling around to every region except for Sardinia and getting recipes. And that's another whole story of that odyssey of, you know, sometimes going to 10 or 12 pastry shops on a given day and maybe tasting upwards to 100 different desserts.
Oh, wow.
And pastries and breads and, you know, all sorts of different things. But
that sounds like fun.
How to Bake happened when I called up. I was friendly with 5 or 6 editors from different publishing companies. And I said, who's the best agent for me? And they kept the set. One name kept coming up over and over. So I cold called to this agency and I said, hi, this is Nick Malgieri. I'd like to speak with Phyllis Wender. And they said, hold on, please. So I said, you don't know me, but I've just written 2 cookbooks for miserable money. And I think it's time I had a real agent.
Yeah.
And so she said, well, send me your books first so I can take a look at them. No problem. I dropped them off the next day. And then she called me up and she said, come in, let's talk. But before you come in, I want you to make a list of 10 titles. And what we're going to do when I meet you is we'll decide what order to do them in.
Oh my God.
And guess what? It happened. Phyllis was that kind of an agent. She knew everybody and everything about publishing. And, you know, all the different vicissitudes that I went through. I mean, that for that first book, How to Bake grew to this behemoth of like 1,500 pages. At which point my editor, HarperCollins, bought it for a lot of money. And my editor just threw her hands up in despair. And she said, you know, you have to get somebody to make some sense out of all this stuff. So, and she suggested somebody that I hated. So I knew that wouldn't be that person. Then she said, you know what? Also, there's Nancy Nicholas. And I was good friends with Maida Heater. Do you know who Maida Heater was?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I knew Maida through Peter Kump, and we became fast friends. I used to stay at Maida's house in Miami Beach.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, it was great. It was great. We were great friends. And I was to Florida often to teach during the winter. So Maida had first mentioned Nancy to me. Nancy was an editor at Knopf. And she was a co-editor along with Judith Jones, who was Julia Child and James Beard's publisher. And she did Maida Heater's books because Judith Jones really didn't know anything about baking. So she and Nancy liked to bake. So from that connection of through Maida Heater, I called up Nancy and she said, okay, she said, you know, that's what I do. I fix books on the side. So we met and we went through all of it page by page by page by page by page, resulting in the fact that we became great friends while we were doing it.
Oh, that's a good perk.
Yeah. And How to Bake came out, and it was, I mean, imagine back then, I did both the line edit and the copy edit on paper.
Oh, yeah. No,
what an ordeal. And Nancy, when she did the line edit, she had this tiny, tiny spidery right. She didn't have, she still has it. And she used a hard pencil rather than a soft one.
Oh
So
no.
it was also not only tiny, but light.
Oh no.
Oh. But so that's how to bake came into existence. I had to confront the idea of doing bread recipes for the first time, and that worked out really nicely. But one of the things that I did when I had the opportunity to, there's a good story about how the reprint came into being. Alice Medrich, who's your neighbor in San Francisco,
Oh yeah.
um, had at one time a chain of chocolate stores called Cocolat. And she had done a very beautiful book of really beautiful desserts and confections. And it was called Cocolat. So I got a call from an editor at Dover who said to me, we're redoing Alice Medrich's book, and she put you on a list of possible people who might do a quote to promote the book. I said, sure. I said, well, send me a galley so I can look at it. And so I write something intelligent
Yeah.
rather than just off the top of my head. And then I said to her, by the way, I said, I just had the rights reverted to a big baking book that I did. And she said, really, what's it called? So I said, it's called How to Bake. It was first published in 1995. And she was silent for a few minutes and she said, oh, I'm looking at it on Amazon. I want this book.
Oh wow. That's kind of nice.
Call my agent.
I love the internet.
I
That's kind of
know,
cool.
I know, it's great. So eventually, my editor at Harper's had this really, really dark hatred for Nancy because she
Oh.
felt that I was a better friend with Nancy than I was with her, which was
Uh-oh.
100% true. So she trumped up an excuse for me not to be able to use Nancy anymore. And I got her to agree to a trial. And when I told Nancy, she said, oh, I don't want any part of it. It's okay. So then I started working with a woman who was writing the course catalog for Peter Kump's cooking school where I worked, and Natalie, and we've been working together on all my literary projects ever since. So that was also a good thing because Natalie and I sat at right where I'm sitting right now at this computer, and we went through every syllable of How to Bake. And because it was great, they took the I guess Harper's was able to send them the files. So I was able to, they put it all in a Word file. So we were able to just, track changes and make all the changes necessary. And I managed to get them to delete a really bad recipe,
Oh
which,
really?
as you know, every cookbook has one.
Oh no, I didn't know that. Okay.
And substitute another for it.
Oh
So
nice.
yeah, it worked out really, really nicely. Dover was wonderful. Of course, they're in, I don't know what the status is now, but their parent company, Donnelly, went Chapter 11 for a while. And after Phyllis retired, a person who worked with her for years on her contracts and financials, Susie Cohen, took over. And I think between us, Susie and I received about 20 pounds of those thick Chapter 11 letters
Yeah.
and of course none of it pertained to us except for the fact that at a certain point Susie said to me, they owe you money. And I said, ooh.
Yeah.
And so I said, can you find out what's going on? So she called the person who was in charge of dispensing the money, and he said, oh no, don't worry, the royalties are going out.
Well, that's God. Thank God for that.
No, I was very lucky. Very, very lucky. Yeah. Yeah. I
So
remember go ahead.
I was going to say, so I really enjoy. You said that you looked at it. It looked great. Now you mentioned it was a large cookbook, but I just it's funny because it is a big weighty book, but it's not overly stuffed full of recipes. I mean, there are a lot of recipes, but not too many. Like I've looked through a few cookbooks where they stuff so much content in that it's kind of overwhelming. But you have some nice little asides where you talk before each recipe, and some of them you attribute them to other people, or you'll have a reminiscence about how this was made for somebody else, like an event or something, and that's really lovely because it adds a lot of personal touch. I feel like we
Mhm.
see a lot of you in the cookbook, whereas some are just like you have no idea. They might be good recipes, but they're just recipes where you put a lot of yourself in it.
Right, right. And attribution is important too. Some people just can't bring themselves to do it.
Yeah.
And I think it's really bizarre because, first of all those attributions that are in head notes, half people don't even look at that. And the other half of the people don't care. But I know my editor at Harper's, the contract strictly stated that no more than 10% of the recipes could have been sourced from other published material. So it's true. I mean, I know somebody who wrote a lot, has written quite a few cookbooks, and found out that some blogger had adapted something like 97 of this person's recipes. I
Oh,
mean,
Jesus.
that's going. I also had a thing where I did a book called the Baker's Tour, which was all baking recipes from not in the United States.
Oh,
And I wanted to do a certain kind of a bread that's very popular in an ethnic cuisine. And I'd known the author of many books about that kind of cooking for years. And when I asked to use that bread recipe, I was told that the place for people to get my recipes is in my books.
oh.
So I said, that was a real slap in the face. Also, somebody who used to call me up and say, oh, I made this banana bread and it sank, that kind of thing. So,
Oh, yeah.
so I managed to, I got in touch with somebody that I knew was a very close friend of this person. And I said, what's with no permission for one recipe? And they said, oh, that's because thus and such asked for a recipe and then wound up using 27 of them in their book.
Oh my God.
So, yeah. So, when people get burned like that, I had an author so plagiarize a recipe for a quick puff pastry made in the food processor that they didn't even have the intelligence to change the dimensions that the dough was rolled out to. So I did a Xerox of that recipe, a Xerox of the one in my book. I put them in an envelope. I sent them to my agent, who sent them to Harper Legal. And they said, yeah, this is a clear case of plagiarism, but it'll cost us much more to prosecute this than we would ever even realize in damages, let alone anything for you. So they just let it go.
It seems like the internet's full of stuff like that. There's so many recipes out that look identical,
I
and
know.
it
Oh,
just people have
please.
no shame about it.
When I was doing a baker's tour, I wanted to do, somebody had told me about a chestnut panettone that they had
Oh,
enjoyed. And I said, oh, that sounds great. Let me see if there's anything online. Right. I didn't intend
right.
to copy a recipe online. I had a really good panettone recipe, but you get an idea or two. So I land on this website. I love this panettone recipe. My grandmother made it every Christmas for us, and I never failed to make it at Christmas time. And it always brings back such happy memories of my family and the holidays. And it was my recipe.
Oh my God.
I said to myself, I've been called many things, but never somebody's grandmother. But that's how flagrant it is. The other thing I noticed, what was I looking up the other day? I was looking up examples of a particular recipe, and it sailed by on Google on my phone. And so I clicked on it and I went to my computer and I went to Google and I put in the recipe. Sure enough, there were 8 different websites that had an identical recipe. Now, somebody must have been original with it, or maybe the back of a jar or a box was the original recipe.
Oh my God. I think that people just think if they copy and paste something, it's theirs suddenly.
Yeah, or there's this fiction that, oh, if you change 10% of it, it's yours. Well, no, if you change 10% of somebody else's recipe, it's still 90% someone else's recipe, period.
Yeah. Now, I looked at your tally of cookbooks, and am I correct that you have 15?
No,
Okay. How many
12.
do you have? 12. Okay.
12, and not counting the reprint of How to Bake, that would be 13. And
Okay.
I also contributed to, and I'm on the cover of, something called The Chefs of Cucina Amore.
Ah, nice.
So yeah, that was a very, very short-lived TV series. Nick Stellino was this guy, I used to call him the pseudo-Italian. He had this show called Cucina Amore.
Yeah, I remember
Right.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was done by this video production company. I think they were based in New Zealand. So he committed the unpardonable sin of asking for more money, and they promptly kicked his posterior out. And then they hired the movie actor Vincent Schiavelli.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, if you saw Ghost, Vincent was the ghost on the subway that taught Patrick Swayze how to be a ghost.
Yeah, I remember him. Yeah.
And yeah, he was also a really scary villain in a James Bond movie. Vincent was good. Vincent was very good at scary. So, and Vincent used to go to those IACP conferences, and several times he asked me about a recipe in books that he had. We wrote 3 or 4 cookbooks, I think. So I said, oh, great. I said, I love Vincent. So I arrived, and I happened to be the last person to be filmed for the Cucina Amore series.
Yeah.
And it was in Seattle. I've been to Seattle 50 times. I had a lot of friends. I loved being there. And the night before, when I had arrived, I invited Vincent to dinner at this club that was owned by some friends of mine. And, so the next day I arrived in the studio, and they said, Vincent's off getting wardrobe, etc. And the director says to me, you seem to have had a salutary effect on Vincent. And I said, well, what do you mean? And then I found out little by little that the other 3 people in the series did not like. They felt he was in the way, and would get into arguments with him about the food.
Oh.
And hell, he was the movie star, not us. He was the draw for people to come to watch this show. I certainly understood that. And he was a little adversarial with me. He said, oh, the pan de España, the Italian sponge cake, which means bread of Spain. He said, well, some people think it means pan de España, which is sponge bread. And I said, nah, that sounds a lot less appetizing than bread of Spain. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And, and then we continued. I wasn't upset that he had said that.
Right.
He couldn't just stand there like a post during the segments. The bizarre thing was that since there were so many different people, poor Vincent was changing wardrobe like 6 times a day order so that when they paste, they cut and pasted all of the different segments together, then he would be dressed consistently for the whole show.
Oh, I wonder about that.
Yeah, since they shot us all at different times.
Right.
Yeah.
We're going to take a quick break to hear a word from our sponsor. And now let's return to our program. Now, I wanted to ask you next, what kind of advice can you give to someone who is considered becoming a pastry chef?
Go to college.
Go to college.
Yes. Have an education, because if you put it off, and let's face it, graduate from college, you're like 21 or 22 years old. It's not as though you're ready to be collecting Social Security. It's education is the most important thing. And I have to say, of the young chefs of today who are successful and articulate and make good food, most of them are educated people.
Yeah.
It really makes a big difference. And, so many times, so many book signings, or I remember years and years consecutively at the chocolate show, I'd be sitting at the book signing table and I would say, oh no, they're coming, right? Two parents or one parent with this very reluctant young child, right?
Oh, okay.
And, they push them over and say, tell him you want to be a pastry chef. And I would say to the kid, go to law school. You never make any money being a pastry chef.
Well, nowadays it seems like pastry chefs can almost be kind of like rock stars. Like locally, we have the tartine restaurants, and those are really huge here.
Oh, bleh.
Yeah.
Oh, not my cup of tea. Well, first of all, what's his name? Chad Robertson and his wife. I can't remember her name. Elizabeth
I think so.
Something. Yeah, they're no longer associated with it. They
I didn't
started.
know that.
The original tartine was the pastry shop.
Right.
And then maybe he did some breads for it. And then the breads kind of took off. And then he did that book for Chronicle, which was a blockbuster.
Yeah. I have that.
Yeah. It's, if you want a 36-page recipe for sourdough bread, be my guest. But the thing about it was that when they were there, they monitored the quality. And when I went to teach at San Francisco Cooking School, maybe not the last time, but the time before that, we went to Tartine Manufactory for lunch. It was dreck.
Yeah.
We had something called coconut tres leches, right? Now, tres leches cake, whether you have it in a Mexican restaurant or another restaurant that likes the idea of that cake, is soaked through, right? This was a kind of bizarre takeoff on what in Italy is called a torta diplomatica, like a millefeuille, like a Napoleon, except the middle layer is cake. So you have baked puff pastry, filling, cake, filling, baked puff pastry. But then what they did was there were like more than, there was a middle layer of puff pastry. So the puff pastry was dry. The cake wasn't soaked a lot because then that would make the puff pastry soggy. So the whole idea of it was flawed.
Yeah, that sounds odd. Because I've had a lot of tres leches cake in my life, and that didn't sound at all like it.
No. And where did the coconut come from, But even in the tartine book, there's panzanella of fava beans with toasted bread and fava beans. Panzanella is bread that's sodden with tomato juice. It's like, that's the whole point of it. So anyway, but, I have nothing against them, but I certainly have been critical about some of that stuff.
Well, and I wanted to ask you similarly, for somebody who wants to put together a cookbook or is thinking about it, what is some advice you might have to a would-be cookbook writer?
Nowadays, that Instagram kind of is ruling the world.
Yeah, admittedly,
You will not get anywhere unless you can prove that you have a hefty platform.
Yeah.
With with tens and tens of thousands of followers. My good friend Cenk Zunmeshay, who wrote the best-selling cookbook in the history of Turkish cookbook publishing, and
that sounds interesting.
Yeah, it's called, actually there's the American version called The Artful Baker, and he spent his graduate school years and also working in a I think a kind of promotions, not a PR company, but a marketing company
Right.
in San Francisco. My God, he loves every square inch of San Francisco so much. And Cenk is one of those people with 250,000 followers and all of this kind of stuff, because he's had a blog for years that's been very, very popular, both in Turkey, in Turkish, and in English.
Yeah.
And I said, that's really impressive, Cenk. And he said, yeah, I guess. But, 125,000 people didn't buy my book.
So when you were reading cookbooks, what cookbook authors do you read? I imagine from what you've been saying, you're pretty well versed in cookbooks.
Yeah, well, when I lived in Greenwich Village, I had 800 cookbooks in my apartment,
Wow.
which is not to say all of the thousands of pieces of ephemera, recipe pamphlets and recipe sheets given out by publishers. But that's a whole other story. But anyway, when I moved, I sent 90 cartons of books to the Van Pelt Dietrich Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Penn in Philadelphia,
Oh, that's a
because
great coup for
Penn
them.
has two other great collections, and I felt it was a really good match for me.
Nice.
But I love Paula Wolfert. She has a book called Paula Wolfert's World of Food, that I think she has a recipe for a pork shoulder, a slow cooked pork shoulder that is made in the manner of a Sardinian roast suckling pig.
Oh,
And or was it Corsican? It's one of those. Anyway, they're not too different from each other. And that's a recipe I think I've made 50 times. But there are a lot of other great recipes in there. There's an author that I love who concentrates on breads and sweet baking of, sweet yeast baking. His name is Cyril Hitz, Hitz. And he's a Swiss who grew up in the United States. And he has been the head of the baking department for Johnson & Wales in Providence. And I don't know that he's still, so we're not in touch very often anymore, but his books are spot on. Really, the real thing.
I'm taking notes, by the way.
Yeah, I know. When I did my bread book, Cyril held my hand throughout the entire time. But it was very, very, very helpful. And let's see. I do a lot of. I read a lot of foreign authors. There's a wonderful book of Italian regional cooking by a woman named Anna Gossetti della Salda that has never been translated into English.
Oh.
And I read a lot in French, and also right behind me, of course, your listeners can't see this, but the bookshelf behind me is all mostly Swiss, Viennese, German, and some French pastry books.
It's an impressive array, by the way, everybody.
Yeah, it's there's the Bible of Viennese baking is called Wienersche Speisen, Viennese Sweet Foods, by Edward Mayer, Mayer, and he was the pastry chef at a fancy hotel in Vienna for many years. But he really set down the classic recipes for all those Viennese preparations. And Richard Olney once said of me, yeah, these young people, they say they don't know about Escoffier, but they've got the book under the bed. So I think anybody who knows anything or writes anything about Viennese baking has that book under the bed.
Since the quarantine, many people have turned to baking, and I think a lot of people are taking the time to actually do it and slow down. I know that's my kind of thing that I've been doing, is slowing down, trying to try things from the beginning. Cookbooks are important because a good cookbook will really walk you through it if you don't have like a cooking school you can go to. And it's really important if you're not familiar with some things. So what do you think of all the cultural term with people kind of taking to making like sourdough in droves and trying new flours and things like that.
I think it's good. I think it's good. You know, if nobody ever tries anything, there'll never be anything new.
Right.
So, I mean, even apple pie was an innovation at one time.
Good point.
So yeah, no, I'm firmly, I'm firmly in favor of that. I know I was on a panel once, and it was in the height of all of the Ferran Adrià El Bulli madness, you know, and I said, well, it's outrageous. I said, but a person does what they do because of who they are. So those are Ferran Adrià's original ideas, but it's a terrible mistake to copy them. Edith Sitwell once said of Gertrude Stein, she's a great author, but don't try to imitate that.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, it was, and I think there's a lot of amateurish imitation that goes on, and that's very, very bad. You know,
Yeah. I mean, I think especially like Adrian Feria, is that how you pronounce it?
Ferran
Like,
Adrià,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. I'm sorry. But yeah, I mean, that would be nice at his restaurant, but I don't think you want it replicated at every restaurant you go to.
Right, right. Or I mean, some you can pick up I mean, with somebody like that, you can pick up like a tiny sliver of something and be innovative with it.
Yeah.
I know when his brother did a book, I grabbed it immediately, and there was a thing. There were these like tiny threads of very crisp batter that were stuck in things, and they kind of made everything look like a hedgehog or a porcupine.
Oh yeah.
And what it was a sponge cake that was baked and then put in a blender with a whole bunch of other ingredients in order to. And I said to myself, the art would have been just making it from scratch out of flour and other ingredients, rather than to do that, which is, it's convoluted. Whenever something is convoluted, it's not going to be, it's not going to wind up being particularly interesting.
Yeah, sometimes simplicity is nice.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. I think people who are well-grounded in technique, which is one of the reasons why in other parts of the world, the people who write the cookbooks that are on TV, not YouTube, are chefs. There's some great Italian videos on YouTube of Italians, like 3 or 4 Italian chefs sitting around in front of a laptop watching the most popular videos on YouTube for things like ragu alla bolognese or lasagna.
Hmm.
And the reactions, the reactions, or very simple dishes like spaghetti alla carbonara, that somebody decides, I'm going to add some garlic and onions to this. It'll only make it better, and they'll say, oh, onions. They have these very bad reactions, very dramatic reactions to
I
the
gotta check
stuff
those
that
out.
deviates from the norm. They're hilarious.
That sounds wonderful. I want to ask you this last question. If you could create a dinner party for anyone living now or from history, who would you invite to the party and what would you serve to your guests?
Oh dear. A dinner party for a guest of honor and other people, or uh,
Just a
guests,
just a guest, yeah, just a crowd
a
of
sing
people. Yeah.
oh, crowd of people. I definitely would invite Richard Olney.
Oh
Although
yeah.
I did make dinner for him once,
Oh wow.
when he was in New York, promoting simple French food in 1974. And in fact, he had helped me to get a sublet of an apartment that was owned by a friend of his. And at a certain point, he had to come back and stay there for a couple of nights. And there was a twin bed arrangement, so it was not a big deal. But I remember the first time he came by, and I cooked lamb chops with thyme and garlic, and I can't remember what I made as a first course. But the second time I had come back from visiting with my parents in New Jersey, and he ate my mother's leftover chicken with a beer.
Nice.
So he would definitely be one. Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas would be two other people. And definitely Edward Meyer, because I have to say, because of my own professional background, uh, the Viennese have always really been very, very welcoming and forthcoming with me. And because Vienna is, I mean, you walk down Blutgasse in Vienna, which is this narrow street that's dark 24 hours a day, and you really think there's a spy with a dagger in his hand following you.
Oh, that sounds fun.
That is very, very, very Viennese.
I gotta
But
go
let's
there.
see, what would I serve? I probably would serve Paula Wilfred's pork shoulder,
Nice.
because everybody always loves it.
Yeah.
Yeah, simple. I would not go out of the way. What I tried to, one of the good, although I started beforehand, but one of the good results of the pandemic for me was perfecting rolling pasta dough by hand,
Oh,
which is completely different from when you roll it with the crank machine,
yeah.
or and that was very invigorating. It's not easy to do, even though I never met a piece of dough I couldn't roll. But the pasta dough is temperamental. It's not the same as rolling out a pastry dough, which has fat and liquid in it.
Yeah, I've been
And
terrified to try pasta dough, and I just one day I'd like to do it, but I have a lot of other things to try first.
well, there's one golden rule to remember. It's 1 egg and 100 grams of flour. Now, what nobody ever told you, that 1 egg in Italy weighs 70 to 72 grams, whereas an American large egg weighs 50 grams.
Ah, okay.
So if you go 1 egg, and especially the people who measure flour by scooping it,
Hmm.
it makes my hand hurt just to think of that. Um, you're supposed to take the measuring cup, gently spoon the flour in and level it off. That's my cup of flour is 135 grams. And that, yeah, 135 grams, and then that 72 gram egg is going to give you something like a no, 100 grams of flour. Yeah, so it's going to give you like a 70% hydration.
Oh,
Yeah, which is more than like the pasta doughs for things like cavatelli or orecchiette, and some kind of long pastas that are made from durum flour.
right.
That is more 50-55% hydration.
God, now I
Yeah,
want to make pasta.
yeah, it's good. It's good. I just picked a whole bunch of basil from my garden, so I'm gonna puree it with olive oil and freeze some, and then some of it will eventually become pesto.
You
But
have a garden there in New York?
yeah, I have a big garden, and also right now my two next door neighbors, who kind of initiated me into gardening again. Um, he passed away first in March of 2020, and then she passed away in February, this past February. So because the husband, Paul, had gotten to be in his mid 90s, about 3 years ago, I took over that garden too. And I still, this year, even though they're not there, planted all the things that they would have wanted. It was kind of, and I think eventually the house is going to be sold. So it
What are you growing?
was.
What are some of the things you're growing?
I have 40 different kinds of herbs. I
Oh my God.
have two kinds of cucumbers, couple of
Wow.
kinds of summer squash. I have zucca rampicante d'Albenga, which is a Ligurian squash from near Genoa, which is very, very long. It's a long neck squash. It's maybe about, it easily grows to 3 feet, and then only has a bulb of seeds at the bottom. So the rest of the squash is really very tender, even though it gets very big.
Ooh, I
Then
gotta
I
get
have
that.
kale, I have kohlrabi. This year, for the first time, I planted the Cossack kohlrabi that
Uh-huh.
grow to be 8 inches in diameter, and it did really well. I have puntarelle. It's a kind of Roman chicory,
Ah.
and you cut off the green part. It's long leaves,
Mm-hmm.
and you cut off the green parts, and then you pull the white part through a screen. It's a special screen that has maybe 3/8 inch wide mesh, and you pull that through and then soak it in ice water, and it turns to all these curlicues,
Ooh.
which you then address with olive oil, garlic, anchovies, and vinegar.
Ah.
And it's very, very popular in Rome and southern Italy.
You mentioned kohlrabi. I think a lot of people don't know what it is. I just started using it last year and I really love it. I think a lot of people should try it out if they see it in the store. It's really one of those unsung heroes of the vegetable
Yeah, well,
section.
it's like a turnip, only more delicate. And unlike the turnip, it doesn't grow underground. It grows above the ground on the stem.
It's got a
So
beautiful flavor.
yeah, it is. It's intriguing. I've during the winter, I usually make a soup, a cream soup with it. It's really good.
Oh, I've only had it raw. I got to try that.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, Nick, I want to thank you for being here today. You've been a wonderful guest, and I really am very honored to be able to talk to you.
Thank you, Dean. It was my pleasure.
That was my talk with Nick Malgieri, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I really had a great time talking to Nick, and I hope he comes back to the show. On Friday, we have Dory Greenspan, who was just also a wonderful talk and was just one of the delights of my life. So please turn in for that on Friday, and I hope you enjoy season 3 as much as I've had recording it. Until Friday, happy cooking.